As always, time is pressing, so we need to move on. And it's my pleasure to introduce Yitzhak Melamed, John Hopkins at Johns Hopkins University, as our next speaker. And he's going to speak on the first draft of Spinoza's Ethics.
Thank you very much. I would like first to thank the organizers for this wonderful event and for inviting me. And many familiar faces, many people I'm indebted to, and specifically my teacher, Michael Del Roca.
Stand and hold it closer.
Okay. I'm simply not used. Yeah. So I'm going to speak today about what I suspect to be the first draft of Spinoza's Ethics. Now, I didn't find it in any manuscript, nothing of that sort. It's a text that was available for researchers for the past 150 years. What I'm going to do, I'm going to speak about the first appendix to the short treatise. I'll basically do a close analysis of this text. Towards the end, I won't have time to discuss, to read the entire paper, to be honest. What I'll try to do is, first of all, I'll have this kind of close analysis of the text. Towards the end, I will consider the possibility that this first appendix was an attempt to geometrically organize the text of the ideas of the short treatise. I'll say that it is wrong. I'll explain why I think it is unlikely. Then I'll make a brief argument why I think that it is a draft of the ethics. And then I'll make a further argument why I think it is, as far as I can see, the first draft of the ethics that we currently have. So let's start. The two manuscripts of the Court of Heinrich that were discovered in the mid-19th century contained two appendixes. These appendices are even more enigmatic than the KV itself, and it is the first appendix that is the subject of my paper. Unfortunately, there are very few studies of this text, and its precise nature seems to be still in question after more than a century and a half of scholarship. It is commonly assumed that the appendixes were written after the body of the KV, and I'm not going to challenge this assumption. The first appendix is written in a geometrical manner, and it contains 7 axioms and four propositions. Now, what is missing, strikingly, it does not include any definitions. No, you have a geometrical method without definitions. This is in sharp contrast with Spinoza's Ethics and the 1663 book on Descartes' Principles of Philosophy that are similarly written in a geometrical manner but include both definitions and axioms. And of course, it's also in sharp contrast with Descartes' attempt in the second set of replies to write a text more geometrical. Descartes has definition. So again, we don't have a precedent for that. One could perhaps suspect that the text we currently have is merely a fragment for a more extensive work which included definitions, and in my paper I will show that this is highly unlikely. I'll say it is. Right now I'm much more sure about it. I think it's not the case. And that the first appendix belongs to a genuine work of Spinoza that never, I would argue, never contained definitions. That's my argument. I think I can establish that. I would further argue that the first appendix is most probably the earliest draft we currently have of Spinoza's magnum opus, the Ethics, but we have a long way to go before we reach this conclusion. So let's start. Generally, the content of the appendix is very close to the two other texts. The second chapter of the first part of the short treatise entitled "What God Is," and the first 8 to 10 propositions of part 1 of the Ethics. A major theme of this piece is the problem of individuation. On this issue, as well as a few others, it sheds a new light and helps to explain some long-standing problems in the argumentation of the Ethics. Let me also note that in one of the two manuscripts of the first appendix, it is introduced by the title "On God," which is, of course, the title of the first part of the Ethics. Though the work itself is written in Dutch, the titles of the various sections are in Latin, namely axiomata rather than kundigheidsheden and proposition rather than Vorstellung. With this introductory characterization in mind, let us delve into the study of this very brief and intriguing text. I will begin by discussing the 7 axioms, then turn to the 4 propositions and demonstrations. Part 1, axioms. So the first axiom of the appendix reads, substance is by its nature prior to its modification. The axiom is virtually identical to the first proposition of part 1 of the ethics, which reads, a substance is prior to its affection, in nature to its affections. It is clear why this claim appears as an axiom in appendix 1 and as a proposition in the ethics. In the ethics, the demonstration of this proposition relies on the definitions of substance and mode, definitions 3 and 5. The appendix has no such definitions. Hence, the claim must be accepted as an axiom. So it's the same content, just within a different geometrical frame, and therefore it has to be reorganized. Oh, I almost got a heart attack because I had a blank text in the page. Sorry. The second axiom of the appendix reads, things that are different are distinguished either really or modally. The closest claim in the ethics is proposition 4 of part 1. 2 or more distinct things are distinguished from one another either by different in the attributes of the substance or by different in their affections. The body of the KV does not contain any clear equivalent to axiom 2 of the appendix. The closest claim that you can find in the short treatise, that there are no 2 equal substances, that's it, is still quite different from axiom 2. On first reading, one might think that proposition 4 is also quite different from axiom 2. Proposition 4 of the ethics, of proposition 4 of part 1 of the ethics, is quite different from axiom 2 of the appendix. Both texts suggest that 2 things may be distinguished by their modes, but while E1P4 asserts that the 2 things may also be distinguished by their attributes, the second axiom of the appendix has instead real distinction, which one might think is a distinction between substances. However, the third axiom of the appendix elaborates on the nature of real distinction in a manner that seems to close the gap between the appendix and axiom 4 by explicating real distinction in terms of distinction of attributes. So basically, I would say that axiom 2 and 3 together give you something like E1P4. Thus, the combination of axiom 2 and 3 is more or less E1P4. Let's look at axiom 3, saying things that are distinguished really either have different attributes like thought and extension, or related to different attributes like understanding and motion, of which one belongs to thought, the other to extension. One question that axiom 3 invites is, in what sense can a thing be related to an attribute, right? He's talking here about 2 kinds of relations. Things can be, look at the formulations, things can be either have different attributes, which is a relation, the relation substances have to the attributes, or relate. And relate here is a kind of a genuine kind, specific kind of relation, relate to different attributes, which is clearly the relationship of modes to the attributes. So, as far as I can see, Spinoza is trying to draw here an interesting distinction between how substance relates to its attributes, namely it has the attributes, and the relation of the modes to the attributes to which they belong, namely they are related, and here related is technical, a rather generic term to the attributes. So we have a distinction between 2 kinds of relation to the attributes, a relation of mode to attribute, a relation of substance to the attributes. The demonstration of proposition 4 of part 1 relies on 3 definitions, definitions 3, 4, and 5 of part 1. Since the appendix contains no definition, it is clear that the second axioms of the appendix had to be axioms rather than propositions, because they don't have the definitions in the background that will allow to make the same claim a proposition, right? The 4th and 5th axioms of the appendix read, I read to you, things have different attributes as well as those that belong to different attributes have nothing in themselves the one from the other. In axiom 5, again, still with the appendix, what has nothing in itself from another can also not be the cause of the existence of another such thing. The ethics analogues of axiom 5 of the the ethics annual of Axiom 5 of the appendix is proposition 3 of part 1. If things have nothing in common with one another, one of them cannot be the cause of the other. The fourth axiom of the appendix does not have a precise parallel in the ethics. The closest is proposition 2 of part 1. Two substances having different attributes have nothing in common with one another. Now, I take have nothing in themselves from the one from the other, which you have in which you have in axiom 4 of the appendix, in that to be the same as having nothing in common with one another as proposition 2 of part 1 of the ethics. And after writing that, I realized that actually the note that is added in the original manuscript virtually says precisely the same thing, that by having nothing in themselves from one another, I understand having nothing in common. So it's not just my conjecture. However, axiom 4 also contains a provision that things that belong to different attributes have nothing in themselves the one from the other, which is absent from proposition 2 of part 1. Its closest ethics equivalent will be actually proposition 6 of part 2, where you have the barrier between modes of different attributes. It is possible that by the time Spinoza wrote the final version of the ethics, he thought that the belonging to different attributes provisions was redundant, since in E1P1 he already proved that substance is prior to its affections. I'm not sure this is the reason, but I don't know. I mean, I think that it's a difference, but it's a tiny difference. Axiom 6, and that's interesting to my mind, is the only axiom in the appendix that has no parallel in the beginning of the ethics. In fact, it has no parallel in the published version of the ethics at all. Here, how it reads: what is the cause of itself could not possibly have limited itself. Again, pay attention to the formulation. What is the nature of this axiom? Why should anyone think that the cause of itself, the causes, could have limited itself? Against whom is he arguing? The closest claim one can find in the ethics is the conatus doctrine, right? Which states no thing can be destroyed except through an external causes, and Spinoza then begins the demonstration of proposition 3 of part 4 by noting that this proposition is evident through itself, making it very close, not officially, but very close to an axiom. Then he argues the definition, and here's the similarity, the definition of each thing affirms that it does not deny the thing's existence. Okay, so there is a kind of nothing will limit itself by its definition. And that while we attend only to the thing itself, I quote, and not to external causes, we should not be able to find anything in it which can destroy it. Okay, end of quote. So divine self-limitation seems to violate, indeed, the conatus doctrine, insofar as it allows for internal delimitation or internal contraction, internal delimitation. Yet it is not clear why Axiom 6 bans divine self-limitation explicitly. So why it's not, unlike the conatus doctrine, it's not stated as a general claim. And as a side issue, I think that the conatus does not really apply to God. I mean, that's, Michael and I have a long debate about it. But I think that at least God conatur naturans, I'm not sure that the conatus apply to it. Anyway, in order to answer the question why you have this claim about causa sui not self-limiting itself, I think that we need to make a brief, I'll do it very brief, historical detour. It's a bizarre detour, but here it is. Pantheism has been advocated by mainstream Kabbalists already by the 14th century. Now, I'll say a bit more about it. I mean, generally, pantheism is taken in the context of the 17th century and also in the scholastic philosophy in the 13th century by Thomas as a heresy. Oddly enough, within the rabbinic tradition, pantheism is innocuous. I mean, there are... the mainstream of the Kabbalah is thoroughly pantheistic. There are very few objections to pantheism. I'm co-writing a book on the history of pantheism in rabbinic thought in a kind of a long way from 1200 till 1970. Till 1800, we found 3 occasions of small pantheism controversies. In each of these occasions, the anti-pantheists were defeated without any question. So pantheism within rabbinic thought is totally legitimate. I mean, you find objectors from time to time, but they will again, there is one in 1215, another one in 1703, another one in 1795. All three cases, they lost, totally lost. I mean, we can show that. In this context, Kabbalists frequently noted that, one of the ways that they formulated their claim that God is identical with nature is just by pointing out that the numerical value of the Hebrew words for God and nature is the same. Teva and Elohim have actually the same numerical value, but they formulated in all other ways, including saying that God is everywhere, and everything is in him, and everything is encompassed by him, and there is no place free from him. Okay? The degree, if you wish to look at how far they would go with that, some of them will actually claim that every single idol, okay, if you look at idols, they're also divine. The fact that someone is having a cult of the idol does not render them not divine. Okay, so it's pantheism as bold as you get. Unlike many of their Christian contemporaries, the Kabbalists did not seem to develop any anxieties, or hardly any anxieties, towards pantheism. Yet the new strand of the Kabbalah, which evolved in 16th century Seifert, and was primarily associated with the school of Yitzhak Luria, developed the doctrine of Tzimtzum, or divine self-limitation, divine contraction. According to this doctrine, before the creation of the world, God limited his presence to the margins of the universe and created the empty space, called Tahiro, free from divine presence, in which the drama of our world could take place. Now, when you have this kind of very charismatic figure making this claim, and on the other hand, you have a tradition of 250 years of very strong pantheism, then the question is, what do you do with that? Lurianic Kabbalah and the doctrine of Tzimtzum were adopted by most Kabbalists within a very short time period. Within, I think, 60 years, it became the mainstream. Yet by the early 17th century, we find Kabbalists, specifically in Europe, who argue that this doctrine should not be interpreted literally. Namely, the claim, in Hebrew the title, Tzimtzum shelo kepshuton, meaning God did not really contracted or limited himself. Okay? And there is a debate, and again, as you can expect, those who supported the non-literal interpretation, meaning the pantheistic interpretation, won by vast majority by the end of the 18th century. Okay? One of the main figures, if not the main figure, that began the interpretation of the non-literal, meaning the pantheistic, and their interpretation of this formula was Avraham Cohen Herrera. Herrera died in Amsterdam in 1635, 3 years after Spinoza's birth. Virtually every single rabbinic figure in the Jewish community of Amsterdam at the time when Spinoza grew up was a disciple of Herrera in one way or another. Some of them translated Herrera, some of them were his close students, but the works of Herrera were clearly known within this context. So that Spinoza was well aware of the pantheistic nature of the Kabbalah, we can learn from his remarks in proposition in letter 73, where he speaks about the ancient Hebrew traditions. Traditionibus in Latin is actually the Latin translation of the Hebrew word Kabbalah. Kabbalah is traditions. And the further explication there that it's traditions that were corrupted, that's precisely the main early modern view about the Kabbalah, that it has some secrets or philosophical secrets that deteriorated through the ages. And Spinoza is saying there, I agree with them, and I claim that we are all living God together with Paul and together with these ancient Jewish traditions that were corrupted. So I suspect, though, that at this stage I cannot prove that the sixth axiom, the appendix, was Spinoza's own contribution to the then ongoing debate on the doctrine of divine self-limitation, meaning he's rejecting the view that God restricted himself or limited himself, precisely just reaffirming pantheism. This suggestion could easily explain why the sixth axiom is directed particularly against divine self-limitation. Okay, so that's my suggestion. The seventh and final axiom of the appendix reads, that by which things are distinguished is by its nature prior to such things. Okay? As far as I can see, you won't have a precise parallel to this axiom in the ethics. Nevertheless, the following paragraph from the demonstration of proposition 5 seems to make a very similar claim. I read it. It's E1P 5D. If two substances were distinguished by a difference in their affection, then since the substance is prior in nature to its affections, if the affections are put to one side and is considered in itself, considered truly, one cannot be conceived to be distinguished from another. There cannot be many, but only one. Okay. So this passage relies on proposition 1 of part 1 in order to argue that the substance cannot be individuated by affections that are posterior to the substance, which is the very main point of the seventh axiom as well. Now, here again, it relies on several axioms, on several definitions. You don't have these definitions available in the appendix, therefore it cannot be a proposition, it must be an axiom instead of that. So, part 2, let's look at the 4 propositions. The first proposition reads, to no substance which really exists can we relate the same attribute that is related to another substance or what is the same. In nature, there cannot be two substances unless they are distinguished really. The demonstration, if two substances are two, they are different and consequently are distinguished either really or modally, not modally, for then the modification by their nature would be prior to the substance, therefore they must be distinguished really. Hence, we can say what can be said of one cannot be said of the other. That is what we are trying to prove. The ethics equivalent of proposition 1 and its demonstration is the demonstration of proposition 5 of part 1, which we have already encountered. In both texts, Spinoza argues that things cannot be distinguished through their modes, since this will make substances dependent on their modes. That's the core of the argument in both places. There are, however, 2 important points that are unique to the appendix version of the demonstration. First, it refers to the attributes as what is said of the substance, which is a nice, interesting thing, which is, I take it to be a technical Aristotelian scholastic term. Modes are not said of the substance, they are in the substance. What is said of the substance would be just the attributes. Second, the demonstration refers to a distinction by attributes as a real distinction, which the demonstration of proposition 5 of part 1 does not employ this terminology. It is also noteworthy that the proposition 1 of the appendix, just as its ethics parallel, in both of these texts, Spinoza is not worried by the possibility that will be later pointed out by Leibniz. The two substances cannot share some attributes and thus be distinguished by the attributes they do not share. I mean, it's a side issue, but it's a common problem to both of these texts. Okay? Finally, let me point out that this proposition shows that the first appendix, unlike the KV itself, is resolutely non-Cartesian text. Insofar, it does not allow for a plurality of substances sharing the same attribute. Okay? Very clearly. Now, one point that I can already insinuate here, and just check it while we're reading that, the demonstrations are complete. They do not need any definitions. So it's clear that it's not a text that once had, it's not a kind of an excerpt from a longer text which once had definitions. The demonstrations are self-sufficient. They simply do not rely on definitions. Now, what's the meaning of that? We'll come to it in a minute. The second proposition of the appendix addresses the issue of causal relation between substances. So the second proposition reads, one substance cannot be the cause of the existence of another substance. Pretty familiar, such a cause can have nothing in common of such an effect, for the difference between them is real, and consequently it cannot produce it, note existence. The ethics parallel of this proposition is proposition 5 itself, which relies on the very same justification. Causation must assume shared attributes in order to conclude that there cannot be causation among attributes. So here's the, I'm sorry, not proposition 5, proposition 6 I meant. So here's proposition 6, it's saying one substance cannot be produced by another, saying in nature there cannot be two substances of the same attribute, namely which have something in common with each other, therefore one cannot be the cause of the other, cannot be produced by the other. So again, insofar as they have nothing in common, they cannot cause each other, therefore one substance cannot cause the other. So proposition 6, arguably, is just the very clear equivalent. Proposition 6 of the ethics of part 1 is the very clear equivalent of proposition 2 in the appendix. One thing that we can learn from comparing the two demonstrations is that for Spinoza, production is just causing the existence of something. Also, we would note that we would note here again that the ban on causal interaction between substances diverts significantly from Descartes' view, right? And also from the short treatise, because the short treatise, Spinoza is pretty hesitant about whether there can be causal interaction between body and mind. I mean, he's making different claims in different places. The short treatise is not unified on this issue. Here, the claim is very clear, no question, no causal connection between extension and thought. The third proposition addresses the infinity of substance and attribute, saying every attribute of substance is by its nature infinite and supremely perfect in its kind, and they must say no substance is produced by another, consequently if it exists, it is either an attribute of God or it has been a cause of itself outside God. If the first, then it is necessarily infinite and supremely perfect in its kind, as are all of God's other attributes. If the second, it also must be such, for by A6 it could not have limited itself. Okay? Let me suggest a few observations regarding this proposition. First, in the demonstration, Spinoza seems to move seamlessly between attribute and substance, treating the two as virtually identical. This attitude is also present in other parts of the first appendix, as well as in the first drafts of the ethics quoted in letters 2 and 4. So there you can see Spinoza moving almost carelessly between saying something about the attribute and assuming that the same thing is really true about the substance. So the distinction there between the substance and attribute in letters 2 and 4 is very fuzzy, very unclear, and I think this is also happening in this text. Second, the demonstration is the first time Spinoza is, the demonstration is the first time God is mentioned in the appendix. And God appears quite late here. Third, there is no precise ethics parallel to this proposition. The closest we have is proposition 8 and proposition 10, since it relies primarily on Axiom 6, which, as we have seen, is absent from the ethics. In the final version of the ethics, Spinoza will follow a somewhat different path and rely on the demonstration proposition. Rely on definition 2 of the definition of finitude in part 1 and proposition 5 of part 1 to conclude in the demonstration of proposition 8 of part 1 that every substance must be infinite. It's the same conclusion, just by using a slightly different track. Fourth observation, the infinity in its kind of supreme perfection of God's attribute is assumed in this text without any appeal to definitions or axioms. Right? In the ethics, we have it through the definition of God. Obviously, a critique could easily pick at precisely this point and say, how do you get that? Right? Fifth, Spinoza's use of Axiom 6 in the demonstration shows that by the limitation of cause of itself, quote unquote, he means turning an infinite substance to a finite substance. 6, I'd suggest the demonstration of proposition 3 allows for a plurality of causa sui substances on the face of it, okay? So far, at least. Dan has a view that in the short treatise, we have Geroux's multi-substances theory, right? at least till proposition 3, I think this is consistent with the text. Now, the fourth and final proposition of the appendix, and is its longest and most substantial unit. It has some beautiful arguments. We'll do it quickly. So, and that's the last one. Proposition 4, existence belongs by nature to the essence of every substance, so much so that it is impossible to posit in an infinite intellect the idea of essence of a substance which does not exist in nature. Right? In proposition 7 of part 1 of the Ethics, Spinoza argues that it pertains to the nature of substance to exist. Right? I mean, it's also echoes of the first definition of causa sui. As the necessity to conceive substance as existence is reaffirmed in, as the necessity to affirm substance as existence is reaffirmed in Axiom 7 of part 1. However, unlike these ethics passages, the fourth proposition seems to say that only in God's intellect it is impossible to posit the idea of the essence of substance, which does not exist. So it does not say that it's also impossible for a finite intellect. I think that in the ethics, Spinoza, in the ethics we have, Spinoza say the ethics, every intellect cannot make such errors, and therefore must posit the existence of any substance. In proposition 46 of part 2 and proposition 47 of part 2, Spinoza argues that even our inadequate ideas involve, I think, adequate cognition of God's essence, and since God's essence is existence, it seems that in the final version of the ethics, Spinoza would make the claim that conceiving the essence of substance involves existence strictly universal, meaning pertaining to finite modes as well as infinite modes. The demonstration is very interesting. So let's look at it. The true essence of an object is something which is really distinct from the idea of that object, and this something either exists really or is contained in another thing which exists really, and from which one cannot distinguish this essence really, but only modally. Such are all the essences of things we see which, when they did not previously exist, were contained in extension, motion, and rest, and which, when they do exist, are distinguished from extension not really, but only modally. And also it involves a self-contradiction to maintain that the essence of substance is contained in another thing in this way, since in that case it would not be distinguished from it really. Also, it could also then be produced by a subject which contains it, and finally it could not be infinite through its nature and supremely perfect in its kind. Therefore, because its essence is not contained in any other thing, it must be a thing that exists. So quickly, a couple of quick observations about, first of all, idea and its objects are really distinct. Okay, that's, I think in the final version of the Ethics, Spinoza will say that the attributes are conceived to be really distinct. Take this as just it's as ambivalent as it can be between real and conceptual distinction. What does it mean to be conceived to be really distinct? Just between the two notions. Second observation, only when essences exist, they are modally distinct from their object. Read this in the context of proposition 8 of part 2, where Spinoza speaks about essences which are not having duration. I think that will be the ethics equivalent. I don't have much time, so let's look just quickly at the final text, the corollary. It's a text that it's not in the ethics we have, but I think it's a beautiful argument. So here's what is going on there. Nature is known through itself and not through any other thing. It consists of infinite attributes, each of which is infinite and perfect in its own kind. Existence belongs to its essence, so that outside it there is no essence or being. So far, everything is familiar from the ethics. And here the argument, which I think is, I haven't seen it in the ethics, is saying, hence it agrees exactly with the essence of God, who alone is magnificent and blessed. So what Spinoza is doing here is just using the identity of indiscernible, saying nature is such that it has infinitely many perfect attributes. Well, that's what we understand also by God. Ergo, God is nature, or nature is God. Okay? So here you can see at least one motivation for the identification of God and nature, where you get it from. I mean, it's a nice line of argumentation. And for this reason, I think that here, although Spinoza does not state it explicitly, I think that here you have already really one substance. When Spinoza argues that God and nature are identical, I think that he speaks here about one nature having infinitely many attributes. So I think that you really have here just one substance, to my mind. Let me just suggest in conclusion, a few brief observation questions, because it's still a text I'm studying. So it is unlikely that this work contains definitions, since none are mentioned in the demonstration, and none are needed. It's a completely self-contained text. Now, why I think that it is not the KV, that it is not an attempt to geometrize the KV? Well, a couple of things. It's much less Cartesian than the KV. I haven't seen here, the KV is I don't think that Spinoza was ever a Cartesian, to be honest. You know, given the fact that in letter 2 he's saying Descartes is a great philosopher, though he had a poor idea of the nature of error, the nature of God, and the nature of the human mind. So he's basically saying wonderful philosopher, bad metaphysics, bad philosophy of mind, and bad epistemology. And that's a child that is 28 years old. So I don't think that he ever was a good Cartesian, but I think the tendency is getting more and more distant from Descartes. The short treatise has some elements that are closer to Descartes. The conceptual barrier between the attributes is much weaker there. All of these elements, and I think I can show that, are not present in this appendix. So this is a much less Cartesian text than what you have in the short treatise. One of the things, for example, that are related to that is God's goodness is playing no role here, right? If you look at the second chapter of part 1 of the short treatise, God's goodness is going to motivate many of the claims of Spinoza. Nothing of that sort appears here. There's not even no mention of that. Finally, another argument why it is different from the short treatise, remember the way the short treatise begins. It first proves that God exists, and then it is going to say what's the nature of God. Spinoza is not bothered by the first proving God, the existence of God in the appendix. It is a completely different order of presentation. So I take this to be not the short treatise. It's a beginning of a different text. It's a beginning of a different text that is written more geometrical. Now, I think that the similarities which I've shown so far between the text here and the beginning of part 1 of the ethics make it quite reasonable that it is a draft of the ethics. Now, why assume that it's the first draft of the ethics that we have? Simple reason. All the drafts that we have from letter 2 and onwards have definitions, and they are pretty consistent. Now, it's much more, at least in terms of simplicity of explanation, it's more simple to assume that we had originally a text in which Spinoza experimented with geometrical method without definitions, and then added the definition, and that's what you have consistently running, and basically without any interference from letter 2, then to say somewhere in the middle he switched, went to this kind of very unusual geometrical presentation and switched back. I mean, the explanation would be more complicated. I have one or two more questions. Okay, so you know what? I'll just 2 points. I mean, first of all, I think Spinoza is experimenting here. He is trying a new method, and you have here a way of trying to, and you know, it's a new method is not born out of nowhere, and here's the way he is doing this experiment. There are many questions that still need answers here. First of all, why he stopped at proposition 4? Why not continue? Second, why omit the definitions? I mean, is there something about not assuming essences that he wants to do? I don't know. I mean, Nietzsche once said that in order to do philosophy, you must learn how to be a cow and just chew. So I'm still thinking about it, but I think it's an important question. Okay, I'll stop here.
Very good. This is a Franco-American dialogue into which we're now going to introduce a Danish voice.
Thank you. But yeah, this works. It's fine. That doesn't work. Oh, well. Okay, so so first of all, so I hope you all have copies, because there are bits of this text that I'm not going to read, because Charlie sent me an email telling me it's much too long, you have to cut bits. So I cut bits. So I hope you will be able to follow along anyway. A second thing, also there are lots of quotations in there that you need to have a visual of it to understand what it is I'm saying. So I hope you have copies of it circulating. Okay, I'll wait 1 minute.
J'ai créé un drive sur lequel il y a tous les textes. Donc ceux qui veulent pouvoir consulter les textes sur leur ordinateur ou sur leur téléphone peuvent m'envoyer un mail. Je vais écrire mon adresse au tableau. Vous m'écrivez un mail avec simplement envoyez-moi le lien ou send me the link, et je vous enverrai le lien vers le drive, et vous pourrez tout de suite voir les textes en ligne. English people, have you understood? You send me a mail asking me for a link, and I will give you the link to a drive with all of the text. My address?
Okay, so let me begin by thanking Yitzhak for a paper that helps us get a substantially better grasp of a text that is rarely discussed in Spinoza scholarship. He has provided a compelling argument for seeing the first appendix of the short treatise as Spinoza's first draft of the Ethics, as a crucial text for understanding the passage from the doctrine expounded in the main part of the short treatise and the Ethics. He has also tentatively suggested that one of the central theses in this appendix, namely Spinoza's explicit denial of divine self-limitation, is a concern that it is hard to understand without a context, like why would anyone think that God would limit himself, and that the most plausible context is the Lurianic doctrine of symptom, that is, the doctrine according to which God, when creating the world, first vacated a primordial space within himself to make room for creation. So the Axiom 6 of the appendix would thus be a rare place in Spinoza where he addressed in an argumentative mode the Kabbalah, rather than just simply dismissing it as trifles and madness, as in effect he does later in the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus. While I have no objections really to any of these suggestions or very much to add to them, I think Yitzhak has provided compelling evidence that the first point is true and that the second point is very plausible. So I will just leave it at that. I would rather like to focus on the text that Yitzhak has analyzed and return to what could appear a detail concerning the axioms 1 and 2 of the appendix. For I think we can learn something important from analyzing this text about the development of Spinoza's philosophy that concerns his attitude towards the notion of accidents. So I shall also consider some related translation issues. So try and take a look at the first two axioms in the appendix and then the text that mirror them in the Ethics. So here you have that on your text in the Dutch and the Latin and the two English translations most widely used these days, so the ones by Ed and the one by Samuel Shirley. You also have in the footnotes, you have the two most current French translations, so Ganot and Poon. So I hope you have a visual of these. So what I'm interested here are the Dutch expressions, and I'm going to have to apologize for my preposterous pronunciation of Dutch. So what I'm interested in here are the Dutch expressions toevallen and toevallig unterscheiden. How exactly we should translate them, and the extent to which they do in fact mirror their corresponding expressions in ethics. That is to say, respectively, affectiones and exdiversitate affectionum. But I first want you to take a look at the English translations, which is Curly's and Shirley's. They're not substantially different. And if we just read those translations, we easily come to think that if there is any difference to consider between the passages in the short treatise and their corresponding passages in ethics, it concerns only the fact that in short treatise, Spinoza speaks about modifications, when in ethics he speaks about affections. So far so good. There may very well be something worthwhile saying about that change in terminology. It is, however, not what I want to focus on here. For in Axiom 1, Spinoza's text actually provides two terms, namely the Dutch toevallen and the Latin modification, modificationes, in parentheses. Now, both Curly and Shirley here seem to think that the Latin term is simply a translation of the Dutch and renders them both in English by a single term, namely modifications. Accordingly, they also render the cognate term, Dutch term, toevallig as modally. The question is, however, whether the Dutch terms simply translate the Latin terms, or is Spinoza, when providing both terms in Axiom 1, indicating some equivalence of two different terms, rather than simply providing a translation of a term into another language? Now, you may think that such questions are just the summum of nitpicking here, but my interrogation is prompted by the fact that modal and modally are not very natural translations of the Dutch toeval and toevallig. Thank you. That's helpful. So you see why you need the text in front of you. Okay. So what one would expect would rather be accident and accidental. And indeed, if you look for other occurrences in the short treatise, you will see that that is indeed the choice for translation that imposes itself elsewhere. I'm not going to read them, there are three of them, but everywhere else it's translated accidental. So, if we follow that practice, as I think we should, it appears that we could better translate as follows the two axioms in the appendix. So Axiom 1, substance is by its nature prior to all its accidents and then modifications in parentheses. And the Axiom 2, things that are different are distinguished either really or accidentally. But why do the English translators then avoid the term accident and accidentally and use only the terms modification and modally, thus glossing over the fact that Spinoza seems to suggest that what he calls modifications are accidents? I think there are reasons internal to the appendix to justify this. Later, in the demonstration of Proposition 4, Spinoza adds in parentheses the Latin term modalita when speaking of wuselig, I'm trying hard, modalita, unterscheiden. And now wuselig and toevallig is not the same term, obviously, but Spinoza also in this context provides an explicit reference to Axiom 2, which makes it reasonably clear that he's talking about the same distinction all over. Moreover, translating modification and modally in Appendix 1 makes a better fit with the terminological inventory of the substance-mode metaphysics of the ethics, where the notions of accident and accidental do not occupy a prominent place. In fact, Spinoza never suggests in the ethics that a mode or affection can be properly described as an accident, or that we can think about a modal distinction or a distinction between modes or between affections as an accidental one. Hence, one could be tempted to project this terminological choice in the ethics back upon the short treatise and opt for modification as a better translation of the Dutch in the Spinozistic context. Such retrospective reasoning would, however, I think, be inappropriate. Spinoza was not always averse to the term, using the term accident. Hence, in the treatise on the emendation of the intellect, he speaks of accidents rather than modifications or affections when writing that no one will ever perceive anything in natural things except accidents. Probably more to the point, in letter 4 to Oldenburg, written around October 61, Spinoza is perfectly happy to assimilate modification to accidents, writing that he understands by modification or accident what is in another and is conceived through what it is in. So why did Spinoza then later drop the notion, replacing it with the term affection in Proposition 1 and 4 of Ethics? Well, I think we can find the explanation in the Cogitata Metaphysica. Here, Spinoza writes about the Cartesian distinction between substance and mode. I only wish it to be noted concerning this distinction that we say expressly that being is divided into substance and mode, and not into substance and accident. For an accident is nothing but a mode of thinking, inasmuch as it denotes what is only a respect. That is to say, when I say that the triangle is moved, the motion is not a mode of the triangle, but of the body which is moved. Hence, the motion is called an accident with respect to the triangle. But with respect to the body, it is called a real being or mode, for the motion cannot be conceived without the body, though it can without the triangle. So, modes alone are real beings, and accidents are only modes of thinking. It seems to me that we can reconstruct the argument as follows. An accident is a property that can be conceived without the concept of the thing of which it is an accident is conceived. But movement is an accident in relation to the abstract concept of a triangle, because there is nothing in triangularity as such that prescribes a particular pattern of movement. It is perfectly possible to conceive of some movement that a triangular body undergoes without conceiving of the triangularity of that body. Say, we can move it 2 feet to the left. The body moved could just as well be round or square, and the movement would still be conceived as perfectly the same, to wit, 2 feet to the left. A mode, on the contrary, is such that one cannot conceive of it without conceiving also of the thing of which it is a mode. For example, if we move a triangular body 2 feet to the left, this movement cannot be adequately conceived without conceiving of the body moved. Movement is a real mode of the triangular body when it moves, because any particular body is caught up in a global causal nexus wherein both its internal, in this case, triangular constitution and external pattern of movement, in this case going 2 feet to the left, are equally perfectly determined. So what are we to make of this? I think I have presented some evidence in favor of the idea that the double Dutch-Latin expression in the Axiom 1 of the Appendix 1 provides us with some important information regarding the early Spinoza's attitude towards the use of the notion of accident. I have also provided evidence that there is a shift away from using the term accident when speaking of modes in Spinoza sometime around 1662-63, depending on what exact date of composition we ascribe to the Cogitata Metaphysica, and which presumably explains why, in the Ethics, he will choose to assimilate modes and modifications to affections rather than to accidents. Now, one contextual way of explaining this aversion to the term accident would be to stress that, as any good Cartesian, he does not believe in scholastic real accidents. According to the Cogitata Metaphysica, he does not believe that one can conceive of properties that are separable from that of which they are properties as anything but modes of thinking. I mean, that's the passage from the Cogitata Metaphysica that I read. But real accidents in scholastic philosophy are exactly properties that can be separated from one thing and attached to another. Thus, Spinoza's resistance to the term accident might reflect his unwillingness to employ a term the traditional connotations of which involve the possibility of separating concrete properties from their concrete subjects. But I think this is as far as I will get with this for now. So I should simply finish by excusing myself for having focused on an issue in the Appendix 1 so utterly tangential to Yitzhak's concerns in the paper I was supposed to comment on. But the matter of fact is that I found so little to disagree with or add to his analysis that I hardly had any other choice. Thank you. Thank you.
getting rather behind with time. Do you think we should have one or two questions, or shall we terminate the session? Yes? Okay, questions? Well, Dan.
Thank you very much, both of you, for this thank you very much, both of you, for this very interesting presentation. I have a brief question for each. Yitzhak, one of the interesting features, of course, of the appendix that you were pointing at was the lack of definitions. Now, in the Tractatus de Intellectus Emendatione, there is a very significant discussion of definition as the beginning, as important to developing knowledge. How do you see then this appendix as related to the Tractatus? And a very brief question for Mogens. One of the features of the Dutch translation of the Ethics that came out immediately after Spinoza's death was the fact that in the margins there are Latin equivalents for the Dutch translations, that go up and down quite densely. Have you looked at those and it might be interesting to look at those in comparison to the Dutch. Obviously, it's not the same translator, but one might get some hints about the equivalences between the Dutch vocabulary and the Latin vocabulary from that.
We've no idea, of course, whether Spinoza wrote this Dutch version. Presumably a translator rendered it into Dutch. What do you think?
About for the short treatise, you mean?
Yeah, the short treatise. Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I mean,
I don't think we know. Do we know?
No,
We don't know whether he wrote it in Dutch or whether it was translated.
You have a very good introduction in the explanation of all the discussion in Ed's edition. But there is a debate. I mean, Mignini is making an argument for one side. There is an ongoing debate about it. Well, your question is precisely the kind of problem that bothers me. I mean, what's wrong with the definition? Why to ban them? And I don't know. I mean, I'm still mulling that. I mean, is there a reason? I mean, is it trying to get rid of notions of essences? I don't know. I mean, and then the question is, of course, how to date that, given the fact that is. So we have the dating of the. I mean, the common perception is that this text was written after the body of the short treatise, and you can see why, because there are a few places where, well, actually not in the first appendix, but in the second appendix, there are some references to the short treatise. But this could also be in just later editions. I mean, possibility that I have to entertain. I didn't have time, but let me add further mystery. If you look at the second appendix, which in itself is a fascinating text, it's basically equivalent to the first half of part 2 of the Ethics, just without geometrical presentation. Okay? So my suspicion is that they might not, perhaps perhaps they were not such disconnected as, perhaps, the second appendix is a draft waiting for the geometrical work to be done, but the claims that you have in the second appendix, I mean, I can do the same here. You'll see that they are very similar. Every single claim that you find at the beginning of part 2 of, not every, but most of them, you'll find in the second appendix. Then you have the last paragraph of the second appendix, jumping a little bit towards about the affects, one word about the ethics, and then one word about salvation of part 5, something like that.
Just one very short remark to Dan. I mean, so at least in the propositions that we have, that are the mirror propositions, so 1 and 4, for the affectio is not. So that's the Dutch equivalent is something like aandoening or something like that. How do you say that? Yeah, thank you. So aandoening. So there's no. I mean, accidents are not there. The question is whether when he uses the term accidental, which he uses in the Latin, how that comes out. However, as far as I can see, the way he uses the term accidental throughout the Ethics is always in some sort of. It's not really accidental in any sort of metaphysical sense. It's always a psychological sense. accidental to our mind or something like that. So it won't fit into this shimmer where you think about modes as accidents in any case.
I think we should end this very interesting session at that point, otherwise we will get seriously behind. So again, perhaps we should shorten the break just slightly and say it's 10 minutes or even under. Perhaps we'll start again just after 12.
There is no break.
There is no break. Oh, so sorry.
So we just need to get out of the way.
We just need to vacate
Okay.
since then.